what happens when a country declares war on birds? And what if the birds win? Hey y'all, I'm Christina and you're listening to History and Hearsay. So I started researching this a month ago and then I was like, I don't know. But then the very next week, someone requested that I talk about it. So let's go ahead and talk about the time that a military took on a bunch of birds and lost. Emus have been common in Australia for thousands of years. In their search for food and water, these large birds frequently migrate hundreds of kilometers over the course of a year. In 1922, in their response to their destruction of a large amount of vital crops, the Australian government changed emu's status from being a protected native species to being considered vermin. After the First World War, the Australian government gave land to returning servicemen in the western region of the country. Often the land they gave these men were in areas that were considered agriculturally marginal, which essentially means that the land wasn't the best or easiest place to grow your typical crops. These inexperienced farmers struggled from the very beginning, but as economic downturn led to the onset of the Great Depression in 1929, the government encouraged these farmers to increase their wheat crops, and in exchange, the government promised these farmers assistance in the form of subsidies. However, with everything going on at the time, wheat prices continued to fall and farmers did not receive the promised subsidies, and by October of 1932, the situation heated up as farmers who were preparing to harvest the season's crops were also threatening not to deliver the wheat. By this point, roughly 1/4 of the farmers had already given up and left to find work in the cities. The ones who remained behind to continue their farms had yet another difficulty to deal with, as an estimated 20,000 migrating emus found their way onto farms. Now, typically, after breeding, the emus would migrate from the inland regions and head back to the coastline, but recent droughts had changed things up for these birds, and all of this newly cleared farmland with all of the additional water sources that had been brought in for livestock looked to be a pretty sweet area for the emus. This was a nice new habitat they had just found for themselves, and they were going to hang around for a while and enjoy it. These 6-foot-tall birds weighed between 90 and 120 pounds, and while they can't fly, they can run at speeds of up to 40 miles an hour. And as they ran through the farms, they destroyed and ate valuable grain crops. They also damaged fencing, which then allowed other animals like rabbits to enter and cause additional issues. Between the loss of crops and damage to the farms, these birds are estimated to have cost these farmers millions of pounds. Now, while these farmers were legally allowed to shoot the emus themselves, they had very limited resources, and so they reached out to the government for assistance. The suggestion was made that maybe machine guns could be a quick and easy way to take care of this problem. The Minister of Defense, Sir George Pierce, agreed. It said that he felt that dispatching professional soldiers to help the farmers would show them that the government took the veterans' concerns seriously. But his plan had a few stipulations. The guns were only to be used by military personnel, troop support was to be financed by the Western Australian government, and the farmers were to provide the food and accommodation for the soldiers, and the farmers were also to pay for the ammunition. Pierce also thought that this would be great target practice for the military, and a cameraman was also enlisted to follow the troops around and get footage of all these shenanigans. So in October of 1932, Major Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery's 7th Heavy Artillery, that's a mouthful, and 2 soldiers armed with 2 Lewis guns and 10,000 rounds of ammo set out to hunt down those pesky birds. And right away, things didn't go well, as the operation was delayed by a period of rain that caused the emus to scatter across a wider land area. So in November of 1932, the troops were deployed with orders to assist the farmers, and according to the newspapers, the soldiers were ordered to collect 100 emu skins so that their feathers could be used to make hats. On November 2nd, the men traveled to the area of Campion, where they spotted about 50 emus. The emus were out of reach of the soldiers' guns, and so the local settlers or farmers attempted to assist by herding the emu into an ambush where the soldiers waited. But these birds were much too smart for that, and they split into smaller groups and ran away so quickly that the soldiers were unable to effectively target them. However, when a second round of gunfire rang out, they were able to kill what they said were a number of birds. Later that same day, another small flock was encountered, and the soldiers were able to kill roughly a dozen birds. On November 4th, Major Meredith set up an ambush near a local dam and waited for the emus to come to take a drink. They waited until more than 1,000 emus were in range before opening fire. This time, they let the birds get much closer before engaging. But apparently, it was simply not yet these birds' time to go, because after only 12 birds had been killed, the guns jammed and the remaining were able to scatter and get away to safety. Over the next several days, Major Meredith chose to go further south, where the birds were reported to be fairly tame. But despite his efforts, the emu continued to have the upper hand. They basically just rose to the challenge every single time. By the fourth day of this campaign against them, the army observers noted that each pack of the birds seemed to have elected a leader or something, because there was always one that seemed to be keeping watch while the others ran around destroying the farms. And when soldiers got anywhere near them, the one that was watching would call out to the others and warn them of the men's approach, and they would all just scatter. 3 days into the operation, only about 30 emus had been killed. Farmers attempted to herd the emus using trucks, but that wasn't effective. One truck even crashed after it hit an emu. So at one point, Major Meredith got the great idea that he could mount one of the guns on a truck, and so they would be able to hopefully move quickly and catch up to the birds. But the ground was so rough that when the truck tried to speed up and catch the birds, the gunman was completely unable to properly aim. And even when the soldiers did manage to hit an emu, they would keep running. They had really tough hides, and so really hard for the soldiers to immediately tell how effective an attack had been, because some of the emus would get shot multiple times and continue running and not die until later on. By November 28th, 2,500 rounds of ammo had been fired, and it was uncertain how many birds had been killed. One account says that it was only about 50 birds, but later reports from the farmers estimated that it was between 200 to 500 birds. Major Meredith's official report noted that his men had suffered no casualties, unless you count their dignity. By this point, news reports were widely publicized about how badly the military was failing and what the newspaper were calling the Emu War. Members of the Australian House of Representatives were getting in on making fun of these guys, saying that if anyone deserved medals from this conflict, it was the emus, who had, quote, won every round so far, end quote. Some even commented that the Emu Command had evidently ordered guerrilla war tactics. Senator James Dunn called Defense Minister Pierce the Minister of the Emu War. Clearly, this whole thing had made him a laughingstock. And in addition to that, of course, you had those who were arguing that taking out emus with machine guns was inhumane. Following all of the negative attention from the media, members in the Australian House of Representatives discussed the operation and the claims that only a few emu had been killed. The failure was a subject of national and international ridicule. Pierce withdrew the military personnel and the guns on November 8th. Major Meredith commented on the ability of the emus to move about quickly, even when badly injured. He said that if we had a military division with the bullet carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks. Now, after the military withdrew, the farmers demanded they return. They still had thousands of emus running wild, and something needed to be done before they completely lost their farms. This is when a report came out saying that 300 emus had been killed, which was then used to justify Pierce's decision to redeploy the machine gunners on November 12th. Now, initially I was thinking, well, the farmers would be the ones to know if there was a reduction in the amount of emus running around tearing up their farms. But if the report came out in order to get the soldiers back out there to help them, it's hard to know if this was the truth or if somebody just made up a number that they thought sounded good enough to get them some help. Either way, this report comes out from the base commander, and around that same time, James Mitchell, the Premier of Western Australia, voices his support for the renewal of military assistance to these farmers, and it's approved for the military to get back out there and take on the birds. While this all seems pretty funny to us now, this really was a serious agricultural threat that needed to be handled, and this is why the military agreed to once again lend guns to the fight. And Major Meredith was sent back out there. The first 2 days of this second round of assaults, the military was able to kill approximately 40 birds, and by December 2nd, the soldiers reported that they had killed approximately 100 emus per week. In a report dated December 10th, 1932, Major Meredith claimed there were 986 confirmed kills, with 9,860 rounds of ammo having been used. This was a rate of 10 rounds to every one confirmed kill. He claimed that an additional 2,500 wounded birds had died from their injuries at a later time. However, historian Greg Beyer wrote that this figure is highly disputed and is likely to be very inflated. Despite the fact that this operation was mostly a failure, farms continued to request military assistance in 1934, 1943, and 1948. However, each and every time they were turned down by the government, who I guess had decided that the emus were unbeatable. By 1934, the government reinstated some old bounties for emu hunting that had originally been put in place in 1923, and they even supplied ammo to the farmers. Now, this turned out to be a pretty good plan as far as getting rid of the birds was concerned, because within 6 months, roughly 57,000 bounties were claimed for dead emus. It was ultimately decided that the only permanent defense against these incredibly resourceful birds was expanding fencing along long distances. However, this was also controversial, as some accused authorities of endangering the survival of emus by preventing them from being able to complete their migrations. By December of 1931, news of the Emu War had spread all around the world, and conservationists in the United Kingdom began protesting the call as extermination of the rare emu. And an article published on August 23, 1935, reported that although the use of machine guns had been criticized in many quarters, the method proved effective and saved what remained of the wheat. Throughout the 1930s and onward, barrier fencing became the most popular means of keeping emus and, of course, other pests out of agricultural areas. However, this continued to be an ongoing issue, as in November of 1950, the issue of emus was once again raised in federal parliament, and the minister approved for the release of 500,000 rounds of ammunition to farmers. In 1999, Australian wild emus became formally protected by the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. In 2023 and 2024, several comedy films were released about the Emu War, which I have not watched any of them, but I may have to go check that out now. Go and check them out if you're interested. I'll have them all linked down below with my sources. Sit. Can you lay down? Look to the emu.